Hello there! This lecture video is going to help you complete your Chapter 10 applied activity on work stress. What a fun topic, but it's something that we've all experienced, and it was actually the focus of a lot of my research in graduate school as well. So we're actually going to be looking at a model from a book chapter that I published today, which is pretty exciting for me. Hooray! Anyway, let's get to it. So first, we're just going to do a basic overview of just kind of the heart of stress theory. Then we're going to jump into my favorite model of stress, which is the vitamin model of stress, which really suggests that too much of a good thing can be bad and a little bit of a bad thing can be good. So it's really interesting. Then I'm just going to briefly touch on some commonly studied forms of work stress, specifically role stress and job insecurity in this lecture. And then I'm really just doing that so that you can decide which type of stress you have the most experience with, so you can reflect on that in your applied activity. And then once you hear what role stress and job insecurity entails and you decide which one you want to focus on for your applied activity, you can just watch the video that covers either role stress if you pick role stress, or job insecurity if you pick job insecurity. I would love it if you watched both videos, but you really only have to watch either the one for role stress or job insecurity to do your applied activity, because you're just going to pick one to focus on. But this lecture is going to be important regardless of which one you choose, because it's just kind of a basic overview of stress. All right, so let's get right to it. So here is my very basic, very limited work stress overview, just kind of a quick and dirty of just kind of the way that we think about stress in industrial organizational psychology research. So in general, we have environmental conditions or objective things that are happening that are called stressors. So those are actual things that are actually happening. Now, those may or may not be stressful based on your stress appraisal. So do you see it as a threat or something that could be harmful or something that could make you uncomfortable? And then if you appraise the objective event or the objective conditions as stressful, then they can have outcomes which are referred to as strain. And these are outcomes of stress like, health and psychological outcomes, or maybe behaviors at work, or the way that you feel about work, or the way that you treat others at work. There's a whole host of outcomes that result from work stress and appraising it as stressful. It's also important to note that there's going to be some individual differences, some person, and some organizational characteristics that kind of influence these relationships. So they act as like moderators, if you want to use fancy research terminology. So they influence the relationship between appraising something as stressful and then the negative outcomes resulting from it, or the strain. Also have an influence on the relationship between an actual objective thing that happened and whether or not the person appraises that as stressful. So if you think about these, right? So the impact of stress really can depend on organizational resources. So like supervisor support or funding. And also those individual perceptions, those person characteristics. So like perceived fairness of budget decisions or job insecurity. So if something isn't good, but the organization makes a decision that negatively impacts your department, but you understand that they didn't really have a choice and you perceive it to be fair, it may not be as stressful as if you perceive that that decision was completely unfair. Also, it's important to note that many objective stressors, again, really only have a detrimental impact if they're appraised as stressful in the beginning. Now, there's a lot of different ways that people can cope with stress, and so we'll get into more specific ways to cope when we talk about the specific stressors in the other lectures. But for now, just keep in mind that there's really two different types of coping. One is action-based or problem-focused, And then the other is emotion focused. And just like the nature of the stress process, the coping mechanism that you select also depends on person and organizational characteristics. So, action or problem focused coping is all about changing the situation, so taking action. Or changing your behavior. So maybe you're asking for a raise or asking for more responsibility. Or maybe you start having counterproductive work behaviors because you feel like nobody's helping you with your stress and you just don't care anymore. So you start stealing and slacking. So there's certain types of ways that you can cope at dealing with the situation, taking it head on. Emotion focused coping, though, is kind of involved with the reevaluation of the stress. You're not really doing something about it, you're just changing the way you feel about it. And some ways that you can kind of use emotion focused coping would be to maybe devalue the cause of the stress, or maybe, care a little less about that stressful situation. So maybe you start to become cynical, and maybe you just start to focus on personal fulfillment from family instead of work. Or maybe you start comparing yourself to colleagues who have it worse off than you, right? So if you are experiencing budget cuts, but you see other people around you getting hit even harder by budget cuts, maybe that can help you feel a little bit better about the situation. We're all guilty of downward comparison, right? Thinking about somebody who has it worse than you to feel better about ourselves. It's also important to highlight that perception determines the type of coping mechanism used. So if somebody feels powerless, they're going to use emotion focused coping because they don't have the power to take action on the situation and change the situation or change their behavior. But if people perceive that they have more control and resources, then they're going to use problem focused coping because they have a better chance of success. That is not how you spell resources, but you get the gist. There we go. Now it's scary, but an inability to cope at any point in this process can lead to a lot of those negative outcomes. And some of these strain outcomes that are focused on in the literature are exhaustion, so just feeling completely burnt out, disengagement, so just starting to care less about the organization and starting to get less involved in your work, depression, anxiety, poor performance, and then if the poor performance gets really bad, job loss. So there are serious consequences to work stress, and I don't have to tell you that because many of you have experienced it firsthand. So now that we've kind of been on the downer side of stress, it's important to talk about the fact that stress can actually be beneficial as well. And so that's what eustress is. So eustress is beneficial stress. And this is going to lead me to talk about my favorite model of work stress, which is the Warr's vitamin model. So this is Warr 2009. So it's a more contemporary theory of work stress. And so the vitamin model is really the first major model of work stress that explicitly examines the magnitude or the amount of demands, resources, and stressors. So it considers the magnitude of stress. Instead of just saying all stress is bad, all stress, if it's interpreted as, or all stressors, if they're interpreted as stressful, lead to strain. The vitamin model is like, no, it's not that straightforward. It's a little bit more nuanced than that. And it really, again, considers the magnitude of demands or stress. Until recently, work stress theories really just assumed a linear relationship between stressful job characteristics and well-being. So most job stress theory is like stressful job characteristics. And then over here would be like wellness. And it just assumes a perfect negative relationship, right? More stress, less wellness. Less stress, more wellness. But the vitamin model of stress really emphasizes this non-linear relationship between work-related stress and employees' attitudes, perceptions, and behaviors, or wellness in general. Warr suggests that job characteristics impact happiness in a non-linear way, like vitamins in the body. So job characteristics. Gosh, I can't spell today. Characteristics. Wow. Impact happiness in a non-linear way. And the reason that he calls it the vitamin model is because if you think about the way vitamins work, right? Too much of a good thing can be harmful. My husband overdosed on vitamin E in high school, and it was like a legit concern. It was very, very bad. It was not a good situation. Also, too little stress can be harmful. And most of the past theories on work stress do not even consider that as a possibility, that too little stress can be harmful. If you think about the linear model, right? Low stress, if you look at the red, low stress, high satisfaction. It's a good thing. But sometimes you need a little bit of stress in your life. Also, you think about moderate levels of something that may be stressful at high levels can be beneficial. It can motivate you. It can make you try a little bit harder. It can also keep you engaged more. So the various patterns of relationships, these nonlinear relationships between job characteristics and well-being really depends on the facet of happiness being studied. So the pattern of relationship between stress and wellness depends on which job characteristic you're thinking about. So there's two different types of models that are the vitamin models. One's the additional decrement and one's the constant effect. So let's first focus on the additional decrement. And as the name implies, it kind of looks like this. So we've got job characteristics here, and then wellness here. So if you look at this, the way it looks, right, these are more for intrinsic job characteristics. And it's really focused on there is decreased well-being and performance after they reach a certain point. So it looks like, well-being and even performance will increase with stress until it reaches an optimal level. And then the more stress makes well-being and performance decline. So some examples of this type of stress would be like the anxiety you experience before an exam, right? So an optimal level of that anxiety, right around here, a little stress over the exam, is really going to help motivate you to study and help you focus on the test and remember the information that you studied. But too much stress can cause you to cram, or too much test anxiety can impair your ability to concentrate and make it more difficult to remember the correct answers. And very little anxiety over doing well, you won't even study and try, so you're not going to do well either, right? So there's that kind of sweet spot in the middle of just the right amount of stress. According to the vitamin model, variables in the workplace that result in this additional decrement to performance at higher levels, because wellness can include performance or satisfaction or really anything, any kind of outcome we look at. The variables that relate to this additional decrement to performance at higher levels are control. So if you think about it, right, if you have no control or too much control, you're not going to be experiencing very good job satisfaction, right? You're going to be stressed out. Or another one, opportunity for skill use. So remember, task variety is an important job characteristic for motivation. But if you have to use too many skills, it's just going to overwhelm you. If you don't use any skills, that's also going to be kind of a bummer. But there's that sweet spot in the middle again. Another one would be variety. So if there's task variety, just the right amount, you're going to be more motivated, you're going to do a better job. But too much variety can be confusing, and too little variety can be really boring. Also, interpersonal contact. So you don't want to be isolated in a room doing your work all by yourself, but you also don't want to be completely distracted by having too much contact and too many people involved in your work. So again, that super sweet spot there in the middle. So that's additional decrement. There's also the constant effect. So you can start to see how the stress process is a little more complex than just more stress is bad, right? So for the constant effect, this kind of looks like this. So again, we've got our job characteristics here and our wellness here. But it kind of looks like this. Like a funky S. So with the constant effect, this is usually a pattern of relationships for more extrinsic job characteristics like support or money or even like prestige. And it tends to result in better wellness and performance, but once a person reaches a desired level of comfort, like right around here, then the additional resources really no longer improve performance, right? So if you think about money, right? If you're super broke, not having a lot of wellness, right? Very stressed out. But once you get to a comfortable standard of living right about here, you're feeling really good. You've reached your peak. And then anything else on top of that doesn't really have the same impact on the impact that getting to here had, right? You just kind of, at a certain point, you live comfortably and that's all it is. And any extra isn't really going to have much of a benefit. So another example would be like relative to school, right? So if you know that the final grades for the class are entered as letter grades with a maximum of an A, and you already have a 94% to receive an A, you wouldn't benefit from completing the extra credit at the end of the semester, right? It's not going to really help your grade any. In this case, the grade would be your wellness. Or relative to this class, right? If you already have 6 out of the 7 badges that you need to earn the A, you're probably not going to complete that 7th module because you've already reached that level that you want to be at. So again, those variables in the workplace tend to be extrinsic motivators like money or even like physical security or valued social position or prestige, supervisor support, career outlook, and equity. So the perceived fairness of rewards based on merit, right? Because if you perceive very unfair rewards and recognition, you're not going to be very satisfied with your job. Once it reaches a fair level, it's good. And then anything beyond that doesn't really make an impact. So Warr also really emphasized the impact of personality and demographics. So he believed that there's within-person consistency of happiness across time. So, in other words, some people are just more prone to happiness. So, individual differences. Some people are just more happy than others. And twin studies actually support this claim and suggest that genetics really substantially contribute to happiness. And that's probably because it's contributing to your appraisal of something as stressful or not, like we talked about earlier. Warr also suggests that different styles of personality, motives, preferences, and routines can have an impact on which type of job characteristics are the most desirable, right? So we have different personalities. That's not how you spell it either. Motives. Routines. So if you think about it, right, that's going to impact what kind of job characteristics you want the most. So for example, if you are an introverted night owl, you may love doing janitorial work at school after hours. But an extroverted morning person will probably not be okay with that schedule and that lack of contact with people, right? So the way that stress plays out is very, very much based on your perception and who you are as an individual. 2 different people can be in the exact same situation and have a completely different experience of it. So take a moment to think about it. Think about the stressors you've experienced as an employee or as a student or even as a caretaker of a kid or maybe a parent. So I really want you to take a second and think about it. Pause this video. Think about the stressors that you've experienced. Okay, now I want you to think if there's an optimal level of that stress that helped propel you, right? Was there some level of that stress that gave you motivation or gave you an extra, fire in your belly to do something versus it just being all bad? So think about it. Is there an optimal level of stress that helps propel you? So pause the video and really think about it. Okay, last thing I want you to think about, how do you react when there's no pressure compared when there's too much pressure? So think about that, right? If there's no pressure, you could stagnate, but if there's too much pressure, it's overwhelming. So thinking about all those things is going to help you with your applied activity where you're going to reflect on your own stress. And if you think about it, right, we all have different obligations, experiences, and brains. So trying to conduct research on such internal and widely varying stress processes is really difficult. And there are several thousands of studies on work stress. And I read many of them in grad school because that's what my thesis and dissertation were focused on. But I just want to highlight some of the most commonly studied types of work stress that are in the literature. Now, again, I'm going to cover these in more detail in the specific lectures for each stressor, but I just want to provide an overview here so you can think about which stressor that you want to focus on in the applied activity. So, again, role stress. And in general, role stress is when you have two or more sets of incompatible demands. And these demands can come from two incompatible roles. So like work-family conflict, right? Work is interfering with your ability to provide or be with your family. Or work-school conflict, where work's getting in the way of your ability to do school. Or maybe your work and your values are incompatible. So you're doing work that you don't feel passionate about or that goes against who you are as a person. You can also have incompatible expectations from one person or from multiple people. And those are all types of role stress. And specifically, these are all role conflict. Okay. Now, role stress can also just be from too much work to do. So it could be two or more sets of incompatible demands, which is role conflict, or it could be just too much work. Or in other words, role overload. So too much work or just too much time pressure. Another type of stress, so this is one type, right? Role stress, either role conflict, all these sets of incompatible demands, or role overload, too much work in general. Or another really commonly studied type of stress in the workplace is job insecurity. And if we're thinking about AI and automation and all that stuff, then I think a lot of us are experiencing a little job insecurity right now. And job insecurity is simply the perceived threat of job loss or the loss of desired job characteristics. It's important to note it's perceived. Perceived job loss or loss of desired job characteristics. All right, so now you've got some food for thought. You've learned kind of basically what the stress theory looks like. You've learned about Warr's vitamin model. I want you to kind of think about that as you look at your applied activity and understanding that there are certain levels of stress that can be beneficial. And then think about whether or not you want to focus on role stress, either role conflict or role overload, or job insecurity as you reflect in your applied activity.